The other part that I want to reiterate is that yes, when we see through the self, right, the human self, the ego, we can say there is no self, like the Buddha did, like I will occasionally do. When we talk of no self or there is no self, it's important to remember that what we're talking about is no permanent entity. It doesn't mean there is no sort of psychological process called a self. Because I think I view the whole self and experience of self as a process. Self isn't a thing. It's not a someone. That's the insight that we see beyond that. There isn't a someone, there isn't a something in there, right? It's a process. It's composed of almost an infinite variety of things, right? Memories and experiences and conditionings and biology, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. So it's a process. And as a process, that process is there. Even when you realize there's no entity, so you realize the process is empty, which means there's no me in the process. The me is the psychological process of all these psychological phenomena happening in a somewhat coherent way, right? Also powered by the reflexive nature of self-consciousness, which is sort of consciousness doing this U-turn, looking back. Where does it look back when it's doing this spontaneous U-turn? It looks back into the mind. It looks back into your thoughts and your narrative and your memories. How am I? Who am I? How am I doing? That's what that consciousness stares at to tell it who it is and what it's doing and how it's doing. Part of getting beyond the self is that U-turn of consciousness that then references in the mind and says, well, mind, tell me who I am and how I'm doing and where we're going and, all of that. And that turn where we're always turning back into the narrative kind of straightens out. And that moment is when that self-consciousness is transcended, because the feeling, the experience, in a very rudimentary way of explaining it, is consciousness turning upon itself, turning around, looking inside what it finds, thoughts, narrative, history, all of that. And it kind of constructs itself out of that process. But we want to have the ability to have some U-turn, right? So we can really turn and go, how am I doing? Or was that action wise or loving or whatever? We want to be able to retain enough self-reflection to be honest with ourselves and to continue to evolve as human beings, but not so much that it's always looking into this psychological, process and deriving a sort of fixed self from it. So the paradox here is, yes, there is not a fixed self, there's not an entity self, but there's a process there. It may be an empty process. It's maybe a self, a selfless self in a sense. I hope that makes sense. But nonetheless, there's going to be that human process. It is going to be there. Right? And then there'll be the infinite expanse of true nature, or of pure, clear consciousness. And it's not that we're going to live in one or the other. I mean, sure, pure, absolute, pristine consciousness just sounds like a wonderful basis to live from. And we can live from that basis, but all along the way, until you take your last breath, there's still going to be, if not a human self, there's going to be a personality, there's going to be the characteristics, there's going to be the quirks, there's going to be all that. So we're, again, paradox. No self, a domain of actual lived human experience where the little me is no longer there. And this totality can function in this spontaneous, integrated, grounded, beautiful, simple way. And this process is even when we see that it is selfless, it's still the relative aspects of each of us that's actually encountering the moments, making the decisions, going to work, paying the bills, doing all those things. There's sort of a human, whether we want to call that a self or whatever we want to call that, that's still there. Awakening just shows us the bigger part of the picture. Like before we've had any awakening, we just think we're this little me, right? Just negotiating its way through this immense and often intimidating life. Awakening shows us that this me is actually, our truest nature is actually this, the totality, this whole process of existence itself, and maybe even what's beyond it. And can you feel our mind, the mind wanting to go, well, which one is it? Is it the me? Am I the totality? Am I that particular? Am I a human being? Am I pure consciousness? What am I? Which one? You see how that conceptual mind wants it, it's just its way. It's this or this or this or this. Where with totality, there's really nowhere to stand. There's no particular place to stand because everywhere you go, there you are.